This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zachariason.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zachariason, and this is episode 760 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by FanDuel. Thanks for tuning in. For anyone who's looking for my rookie rankings, they're out there. You can purchase the Late Round Prospect Guide, which was updated on Saturday night, and you can get those rankings there. And they're on Patreon too. I'll do a post-draft rookie ranking show next week. But each season, I like to do this episode first. I like to sit back and analyze what we just watched. But instead of just sitting here and saying, Jackson Smith and Jigba will do X, Y, and Z with the Seahawks, I try and look at some of the lower key storylines from the draft. Sometimes it's not about what teams actively do. It's not just about the players that they draft. It's also about the players who they didn't draft. So today, I'm going to analyze some of the front office decision making that we saw from the draft. Now, before I get going, I do want to give a shout out to the Late Round Prospect Guide. You can get the guide right now on lateround.com for just $14.99. And like I said, it's totally updated. Prospect scores, updated profiles, rankings, and more. Check it all out on lateround.com and get ready to dominate your rookie drafts. Now let's dig in. I think the most interesting spot to analyze today is Seattle. And it's not the Jackson Smith and Jigba pick. It's the Zach Charbonnet pick. They decided to get Charbonnet in round 2 after spending a second rounder on Kenneth Walker last year. Now, I talked about this on the show earlier this offseason. I mentioned it in the prospect guide too. Kenneth Walker had a very overrated rookie season. He ranked dead last in success rate among 100-plus attempt rushers last year. He failed to gain positive yards per rush at the highest rate in the league. He's not a bad running back. He's just a home run hitting running back. And then all the while, I'm not sure we saw his pass catching concerns get wiped out. He had a bad receiving profile coming out of college. And when he took over that backfield after that Rashad Penny injury, he averaged a target share per game rate of just 7.5%. For a bell cow back, that's not very high. So what did Seattle do? Well, we know Pete Carroll loves himself some running backs, so they went out and got Zach Charbonnet. I've already seen people on Twitter say that it's somewhat of a redundant asset. And I'm not backing this pick at all. I'm not saying it was a good pick. I don't think Seattle needed to do this. But if you look at what Charbonnet brings to the table, it's a different skill set than what Kenneth Walker brings to the table, despite both of them being higher volume backs. Charbonnet is more of a grinder. He had one of the highest success rates in college football last year. My friend Hayden Winks from Underdog Fantasy, he said this about Charbonnet back in a February write-up. Quote, his 7.1 yards per carry on 1st and 10 and 2nd and 10 runs is impressive, but his 72% success rate on carries with 3 or fewer yards to go projects well for red zone success and NFL touchdowns. Guys, Charbonnet is a reliable grinder when Kenneth Walker was a home run hitter in year 1. That pairing makes plenty of sense. It doesn't necessarily make sense when you factor in draft capital, but the pairing does make sense. And Charbonnet also had a better receiving profile coming out. Walker's best season reception share in college, 5.4%. It was really low. Charbonnet was closer to 13%. They're not the same type of running back. I think Seattle wanted someone who could be a more reliable 3-down back. And while that might not come to fruition because Charbonnet still has to prove himself in the NFL, that's at least the logic here in my opinion. And of course, this is not a good situation for fantasy. It understandably knocks Charbonnet down a tier in rookie drafts. And Kenneth Walker obviously takes a hit because he doesn't have that same bell cow potential. But strictly from a player evaluation standpoint, I understand what Seattle was thinking. I just don't understand why they had to do it. The Ravens took Zay Flowers in the first round. They already have Mark Andrews, of course. They signed OBJ this offseason, and Rashad Bateman's still on the roster. This is not going to be your Greg Roman Ravens. Todd Monken's the offensive coordinator there now, and we're bound to see a more pass-heavy approach from Baltimore as a result. That's definitely part of the reason I think Baltimore went after Flowers. They're finally making real investments at pass catcher. And this pass catching group is pretty impressive now. OBJ might be dust, we're not totally sure, but it seems like people are forgetting about Rashad Bateman. He just hasn't been able to stay healthy. Last season, though, he ranked 12th among qualified wide receivers in yards per route run. Let me read you the players who ranked ahead of him. Tyreek Hill, Justin Jefferson, Rashid Shaheed, A.J. Brown, Jalen Waddle, Stephon Diggs, Devontae Adams, Chris Olave, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Cooper Kupp, and CeeDee Lamb. That's it. That's a great list to be part of. And with a pass-heavier offense, Lamar Jackson's a more attractive fantasy option. There's more opportunities for scrambling, and more of their touchdowns will naturally come through the air versus on the ground. They'll still be a below-average team in pass rate more than likely. But the Ravens making this move is definitely another signal that this Greg Roman offense is no more. Flowers also has a chance to climb this depth chart and become the number one option at wide receiver. He's a talented guy who can line up everywhere. And he's yet another option who can beat defenses down the field. So I'm expecting a pretty vertical passing attack. The Bills took Dalton Kincaid in the first round despite having Dawson Knox on their roster. And they didn't address slot receiver. They did draft Justin Shorter in the 5th round, but Shorter's a big-bodied physical specimen. He exited high school as a 5-star recruit, but he wasn't able to do a whole lot at Penn State and Florida. He played 5 seasons and scored 8 total touchdowns. That's a rough sign for a physically gifted player. That means the Bills probably like what they have in Khalil Shakir, and they should. He's a great player. And beat reporters are saying as much too. But I will say, I think Dalton Kincaid's going to occupy that spot on the field a whole lot in this offense. So while Shakir walked away from the draft with a win, and I'm very excited about that because I'm a truther, and he should get more run this year in that Bills offense. But Dalton Kincaid is still someone who's going to impact him in fantasy. And speaking of Kincaid, because he didn't test, my new tight end prospect model doesn't have him as the tight end 1. He's the tight end 2. He maybe would have been the tight end 1 had he tested. But the top tight end in that model, just as an aside, is Sam Laporta. I still have Kincaid ranked ahead of Laporta in my post-draft rookie rankings, but Laporta's looking like a nice value in early rookie drafts that I've seen. Now, speaking of tight ends, this class is filled with good ones. And another one who looks good in that model is Luke Musgrave, who landed in Green Bay. The Packers rarely would surround Aaron Rodgers with higher-end tight end, wide receiver, pass-catching picks. But they did the opposite in this draft for Jordan Love. Musgrave went 42nd overall, and then they went out and they drafted my guy Jayden Reed 8 picks later. If you look at the Packers depth chart pre-draft, it was lacking. It did not look good at pass catcher. They had no legitimate tight end, and outside of Christian Watson and Romeo Doubs, there was no depth at wide receiver. But it's the type of capital that they spent to get these guys that's important. They spent 2 top 50 picks to get Reed and Musgrave. And then they spent a 3rd rounder on tight end Tucker Kraft. And then later in the draft, they got a couple of more wide receivers. When you have a good quarterback in Aaron Rodgers, you can rely on him to help his pass catchers out. I'm not saying that's the way to go. I'm not saying that's the way you should team build. But that's clearly what the Packers have been thinking over the last decade. When there's more of a question mark in Jordan Love, you want to surround him with as much help as possible. The Jayden Reed pick got me very excited in particular. He looked pretty good in my prospect model pre-draft, and one of his comps was Stephon Diggs. I talked about Reed a lot pre-draft on this show, for anyone who listened to those earlier episodes. And with Romeo Doubs and Christian Watson, I do think there's a non-zero chance that Reed is the team's top target hog when we get into 2024. It wouldn't make that much sense to predict that for him here in year 1. But Watson wasn't some super high volume guy last year, and he might not be that kind of player in the NFL. It doesn't mean he won't make a giant impact. He's just not going to necessarily see a 25% target share year in and year out. He's just a hyper-efficient player. And while I did like Doubs as a prospect, Reed is the better prospect between the two. From what I'm seeing early on, Reed and Musgrave, they're both targets in rookie drafts right now. One of the storylines in the draft was teams with established running backs getting some of our favorite pre-draft running backs. Charbonnet to Seattle was one. Tank Bigsby going to Jacksonville was another. Izzy Abanikanda going to the Jets. Tajay Spears getting drafted by Tennessee. None of those players are walking into a situation like Dameon Pierce was walking into last year. But I would argue that there really weren't many situations like that across the league in the first place. So while it's frustrating, when you take a step back, should we have expected any different? Doug Peterson and the Jags openly talked about adding a running back in this draft all offseason. That one wasn't that much of a surprise. And while there is some worry that they go back to how they used Travis Etienne at the beginning of last year with James Robinson, we're probably looking at something in the middle of that and how he ended his season. During his first 6 games, Etienne averaged just a 39% running back rush share per game. He was around 75% from then through the end of the year. So with Tank Bigsby, maybe we see Etienne at like a 60% running back rush share. There's just no doubt that the Jags don't want Etienne to have a top 5 or a top 10 running back rush share in the league. They want to keep him fresh, which is why they got Bigsby. And my model likes Bigsby. Now, Izzy Abanikanda was a really frustrating selection, but he has a good chance to climb that depth chart in New York and be the team's number 2 running back right away. Breece Hall is also coming off an ACL. And look at what the team did this offseason. They added Aaron Rodgers. They want to win right now. They're going to be competitive this year. So looking at the why here, they probably wanted a reliable runner who can carry a big workload if Breece Hall isn't totally ready, because they need to win right now. But then when Hall is ready, Abanikanda is a really good complement with big playability. And then with Spears, I personally don't think that he's built to be a bell cow running back in the NFL. He didn't have this massive workload in college. So expecting that to change in the NFL seems a little bit foolish. But Derrick Henry's getting up there in age, and there's a chance that he's not on the team next year. At the very least, Spears is a really good complement for Derrick Henry. Like a very good one. He was massively efficient in college, and that's the kind of role that I think he plays in the NFL, with some random spiked weeks if an injury hits. And make no mistake, you guys, he's a much, much better prospect than Hassan Haskins was last year. So while those players didn't find the perfect landing spots, you can at least understand why these front offices did what they did. To me personally, it's frustrating that Izzy Abanikanda and Tank Bigsby were 2 of those backs, because I did really like them pre-draft. Now on the flip side, there were some established running backs that we were worried about entering the draft, and they escaped either with no additional competition or very little competition. There are 5 guys that I want to call out most here. There are more who didn't see added competition, but I think these 5 guys are the most interesting. I don't really think talking about James Conner is nearly as worthwhile. But the first is Ramondre Stevenson. The Patriots lost Damian Harris this offseason, and there were reports from The Athletic earlier in April saying that the Patriots, quote, have quietly shown interest in adding another blue chip back. Not only did they not do that, they didn't add a running back at all in the draft. And I think that was by far the smartest thing for them to do. Ramondre Stevenson's a do-it-all back, as evidenced by his absurd 17.4% target share per game rate last year. But New England also added James Robinson this offseason, and they still have Pierre Strong and Kevin Harris rostered. Last year, Pierre Strong compared very favorably to an Elijah Mitchell coming out. And Kevin Harris, according to my prospect model, was the most underrated back in last year's class. But overall, Stevenson's looking good post-draft. And those other running backs in the Patriots roster, they should be rostered in Dynasty. Now, Tony Pollard's another one. I do think the Cowboys are still candidates to get one of the veteran free agents that's still out there. Maybe even bring back Ezekiel Elliott. But all Dallas did in the draft was take an undersized back in Deuce Vaughn, a player who won't grab hold of a huge backfield share in the NFL. Pollard is substantially better than any free agent running back that the Cowboys could bring in, though I do expect him to not have like a Saquon Barkley type workload. That doesn't matter as much for Pollard, though, because he's just so efficient. He's a big winner with Dallas not taking a bigger bodied back in the draft like Roschon Johnson or Izzy Abanikanda. And then there's Rachaad White. I was into White last year as a prospect because, of course, his receiving profile was awesome. I'm a sucker for a good receiving profile. His top comp was David Johnson, and that got me excited too. He wasn't very efficient as a rookie, though, but it's not like Leonard Fournette was either. It was a bad situation in Tampa Bay, but the Buccaneers didn't add anything in the draft, which signals that they're ready to give White a bigger workload. Now, they did get Sean Tucker as an undrafted free agent, and I think Tucker is worth a late round dart in rookie drafts. The reason he didn't get drafted is because of medicals, but White is still a huge winner from the draft. And so is my guy Isaiah Pacheco. Pacheco's year 2 model score didn't look so hot because it's going to be hard for a day 3 pick, a 7th rounder, to look favorable in that model. A high percentage of day 3 running backs who show up during their rookie seasons end up losing work in year 2. Teams add competition. The Chiefs didn't address running back at all, though. I think Pacheco is bound to be the early down guy for them this year, but they currently only have Clyde Edwards-Helaire and LaMichael Pirine behind him. I would imagine they look to bring Jerick McKinnon back. But as we saw in the playoffs, Pacheco's role got better and better down the stretch, so it was a huge, huge W for him. But I think arguably the biggest surprise that not enough people are talking about is with Carolina. I was pretty convinced that when they signed Miles Sanders, his price would only fall as we move through the offseason. Their running back coach, Deuce Staley, is one who definitely favors committees. He's talked about that a lot. The Panthers don't have a ton of good depth behind Miles Sanders. Chuba Hubbard is fine, but he's closer to a backup than a true committee back. The Panthers didn't have a ton of draft capital, but they didn't address running back at all. So Miles Sanders could have a really great workload in 2023. If you're not a contender in Dynasty, though, and you have Miles Sanders, I would consider him a sell in that situation, even if you have to swallow this season's production. Now, there were a handful of teams in this draft who took shots at wide receiver, not because they had an immediate need per se, but because they'll have a need very soon, or as soon as 2024. Jackson Smith-Njigba is actually one of those wideouts. Tyler Lockett's getting older, yes, but he's also a potential cut candidate in 2024. I'm not sure the Seahawks go that direction, but it's sort of killing two birds with one stone with JSN. Cedric Tillman's another one. He profiles as a big perimeter guy who could play opposite of Amari Cooper. But that's Donovan Peoples-Jones' role. But DPJ is also on the last year of his rookie contract. So Tillman not only could step in this year and make noise, but this is the Browns having more outs in the future. So that's something to consider in rookie drafts. The Bengals took a couple of day 3 wideouts because Tyler Boyd and T. Higgins, they're free agents next year. So they're probably thinking, hey, maybe we get lucky and one of them hits. But the one player who I really thought was a good pick when being forward thinking, and this is the opposite of what the team did last year, but it was Tyler Scott out of Cincinnati going to Chicago. It was absolutely absurd that the Raiders took Trey Tucker, Scott's teammate, before Scott. Scott had far better collegiate production. He's an early declare wide receiver. And he had a really strong best season touchdown share in that Bearcats offense. He can stretch the field out of the slot and give that offense a nice vertical element. And why he was such a good pick is because both Chase Claypool and Darnell Mooney are free agents next year. There's a chance that if Tyler Scott shows up during his rookie season, and my model views Scott favorably, he could walk in and be the team's number 2 wide receiver in 2024. I mean, you could argue that he's another Darnell Mooney type, that he'd directly be replacing that type of piece in the Bears offense. So as a result, it may look like in the short term that this is a crowded situation for Scott, and it is. The Bears offense is also not that attractive for a pass catcher from a fantasy perspective. But he has a real shot to appreciate in value year over year. He's one of my favorite late round rookie draft picks. Now I'm going to end today's show talking about Jahmyr Gibbs, because there's so much to unpack with him, his fantasy outlook, my process, and what it all means. I let it be known this offseason how size at running back is important. And it is important. It's very important. It's not important necessarily from a real football standpoint, but we can't deny that historically, teams have given bigger-bodied running backs more work in the NFL, even when you adjust for talent. That matters in fantasy football. Gibbs was expected to be a first rounder, but a late first rounder, maybe even an early second rounder. And because of that, he was roughly a 93rd, 94th percentile guy in my prospect model pre-draft. Usually the 95th percentile is where we see studs for fantasy purposes. And then he went 12th overall, which was totally unexpected, especially since the Lions at the time had DeAndre Swift. And that totally changed his outlook for me. You may say, why would that matter, JJ? He's still on the smaller side. He's still the exact same running back. And that's true, but I care about draft capital, and my model does too. I talked about this on last week's mailbag episode, but I have no problem factoring in draft capital into my process. It gets signal. It matters. To me, it would be stupid to not factor in draft capital. And not only signals that a team may give a guy work, but an entire front office of people who spent millions of dollars evaluating these players, they pinpointed that one single player and they said, we want to draft him. In this case, we want to draft him 12th overall. Now, of course, this is not a flawless process. There are bad picks all the time. Sometimes they're obvious too. But with running backs, with a guy like Gibbs, draft capital needs to be a pretty big influence. Because Gibbs' analytical profile as a second round pick, it kind of sort of had been seen before. He definitely had a better receiving profile than the other small second round running backs that we've seen historically. And that's why he was better than the Gio Bernard comps. Gibbs was always a good prospect. Like I said, I'm a sucker for receiving work. But it was harder to see the ceiling with that kind of draft capital. When you completely shift those expectations and make him a top half of the first round player, he becomes a complete and total outlier. Period. We do not see players like Jahmyr Gibbs very often at all. He's not like those second round players because his draft capital is significantly better than theirs. Now, instead of being semi-close to a Gio Bernard from a comp standpoint, he's closer to Christian McCaffrey. Because again, I'm not sitting here trying to project where these players are going to get drafted. I don't care about that. I'm trying to model this out to help you guys win fantasy championships. How I and my model felt pre-draft is not nearly as important as how things look post-draft. And this is when we're doing our rookie drafts. 99% of you are doing them after the NFL draft. Gibbs' score in my prospect model is now more in line with what we saw from Najee Harris and Travis Etienne. But from a percentile standpoint, he's a 98th percentile player. He's actually pretty close to Bijan Robinson, although their raw scores aren't necessarily as close. The hit rates for running backs with this type of draft capital is phenomenal. And for anyone comping him to Clyde Edwards-Helaire, he went significantly higher in the draft than CEH. And he's got a much more intriguing profile overall. It's not the same thing. And this isn't to say that his size is no longer a concern. It's still a concern. Just like it was somewhat of a concern for Christian McCaffrey. And I also don't think that Gibbs is a McCaffrey level prospect. CMC is the second best running back prospect in my database, behind only Saquon Barkley. Gibbs is not that high, but he looks very, very, very good post-draft. And at the very least, for dynasty purposes, he's almost definitely going to maintain value from year 1 to year 2. We rarely see these first rounders lose significant value, let alone from a player who went this high. The Lions clearly have a plan. Gibbs is like a better version of DeAndre Swift. And Swift, despite all the issues that he had with that team and with his health, Swift saw a 12.5% target share last year. His target share per game rate was 15%. It was 17.5% the year before. Those are elite numbers. Given that the Lions spent this kind of draft capital to replace DeAndre Swift, it only seems logical to think that they have plans to use Gibbs even more. To me, Gibbs is now in his own tier after Bijan Robinson and single quarterback rookie drafts. Sometimes that's what draft capital can do for a player. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks for listening, everyone. I'll talk to you later in the week with the mailbag episode.